Genesis chapter 11, verses 5 through 9 says, "Now the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the men had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they have started to do, and now nothing which they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it was named Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Let me give you some more Hebrew to better understand what's happening. The words "God came down" mean to go down, descend, decline, march down, sink down in the Hebrew. It says God came down to see. To see means to inspect or see in Hebrew. God came down to see the tower. And we already know that the tower means an elevated place or stage or pulpit. So God is descending to the level of mankind in order to inspect this elevated stage tower structure they have built. Of course, God doesn't have to investigate to know what's going on in his universe. The language is used only to dramatize God's intervention. God is taking note that they are one, and in Hebrew that means one or united as one. They had a unified purpose to disobey the command of God. This sounds a little like things before the flood, doesn't it? So the people are one and have the same language. God is basically shaking his head and saying this disobedience is what they are united in choosing to do, and their one language makes that decision easier for them. What did God mean by this? He meant this unity to do exactly what he said not to do. Now, before you think that it was just the building of this super flashy tower to make themselves great that was the problem, it's very important to look at the meaning of the Hebrew word for "this is what they have started to do." In the original language, it means to profane, defile, pollute, desecrate. And as if those words were not bad enough, it also means to defile or pollute oneself ritually or sexually. So the language God is using is very descriptive of just how bad this unified decision to disobey God's command was. The people were united or unified in choosing to defile themselves and pollute themselves. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's finish understanding what God is saying. In English, the phrase, "and now nothing which they plan to do will be impossible for them," kind of makes it sound like they had reached a godlike status and were all powerful. But what it means in the Hebrew is, "and now absolutely no thing will be made inaccessible or be withheld for them." So what God is saying is not that they have godlike power, but rather the unity of mankind would only give people a false sense of power that would lead them into even greater rebellion against God. In other words, they would sin successfully and then get a greater taste for it. So God intervenes in mankind's plans. God in heaven is never perplexed or paralyzed by what people do on earth. Babel's conceited "let's go up" idea was answered by heaven's calm "let's go down." Remember, the motivation of the people was their pride, just like with Adam and Eve. Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty or arrogant spirit before a fall." The Bible's warning about pride seems to fit what happens in this story perfectly. There's only one direction for this to go: down, a fall or destruction. By confusing their language and scattering them over all the earth, God graciously spared their lives and gave them opportunity to return to him and obey. He could have destroyed the builders, their city, and their tower, but he chose to let them live. This is mercy exercised within judgment once again. All these chapters of Genesis that we have been studying simply reveal that where mankind disobeys God, the Lord judges sin, and then, in His grace and mercy, He makes a new beginning. So now God has scattered the people by their different groups according to the languages they began to speak. They grouped up with others they could understand. There's a famous statement made by an Augustinian monk named Thomas Kempis, which basically says, "Man does what he can, God does what He will." I think the Bible states it a little more clearly. Proverbs 19:21 says, "There are many plans in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the Lord's counsel, that will stand." The word Babel also sounds like the Hebrew word balal, which means confusion. Because of God's judgment, Babel, or the gate of the gods, became the door to confusion. Instead of making a name for themselves, God gave their project a new name. In His church, God is not the author of confusion. But in the world, God sometimes uses confusion to humble people and keep them from uniting against His will.